The second thing about this pointing gesture that's unique evolutionarily, or if not unique, certainly unusual, highly unusual, is that it's a cooperative. So I'm telling you something that I think you are going to find relevant and interesting. And this is where Grice comes in, this kind of cooperative motive. I'm saying, there's your stolen bicycle. Now, that's a normal thing for us, a normal kind of communication and communicative motive, but that's, I mentioned this in one of the previous lectures. This is not something that you see often in the animal kingdom, of one animal just informing another of something helpfully. I mentioned some of the alarm gestures and how that might, alarm calls and how those might be interpreted last time, and I'm happy to talk about that again. I'll skip that right now. What I want to focus on here is the comprehension part of it. Not only do I have an informing motive, but when you're trying to figure out what I mean for you when I point, you assume that I have a cooperative motive. So you ask yourself something like the question, if I go like this and you look over there, you ask yourself, why does he think that looking over there will be interesting or useful for me? You're assuming that I have your interests in mind when I'm doing this. I'm not pointing over there for myself. I'm pointing over there because I have something I want you to know or to think or to pay attention to. Right? So this cooperative motive sets in motion this kind of interpretive process. And the interpretive process is that I have communicative intentions. So I have something I want to convey to you, if you use the convey metaphor. I have something I want you to feel or know or think or attend to. And you are making inferences by looking in that direction, and some other cues like my expression. We were talking a lot about expression. I can go, or I can go, so my expression and my pointing gesture, and together you are going to make inferences. So I have intentions, and you make inferences about what my intentions are, and that's the way we get it together. Now again, the amazing thing is, this is amazing enough when it's in language, but language has all this content, all these terms that have meaning sort of almost on their own, not really, but almost on their own. And this, there's no semantic content. There's only a finger in this direction, and it can mean pretty much anything. So that's, for me, in praise of the pointing gesture, about showing this shared intentionality framework that I'm going to elaborate on for most of the rest of the lecture. So some people might think that the reason we can do this kind of complicated stuff like this is because we already have a language. But that's not the case, because we have young children that are basically pre-linguistic. So these are a bunch of examples. I'm not going to read all of them. You don't need to read all of them. But they're starting at 11.5 months and going to just under 14 months. And they're examples of young children pointing that have some of this same structure. So down at the bottom here, you'll see that these are examples of a couple of kids who've had some kind of a noisy accident in their room, and the mom wasn't there. And they come in, and the kid points to the place where he bumped his head, for example, for mom. Right? So without this context that, oh, this made a noise, mom heard that I had some kind of accident, there's where I had the accident. Okay? But you have to, so it's got that kind of complication to it, that it's embedded in the context, but it's a mutually known context. So even though it's simpler than the library is still open, the structure of what happens here is basically the same. The child is communicating a complicated thought by this very weak, if you will, this empty semantic marker. It's not a semantic marker. It's an indexical gesture. Just by directing attention is communicating a complex thought. So now to tie this to the cooperative stuff that I've been talking about the last 2 days, in my 2008 book, I proposed the following sort of evolutionary hypothesis, and there are 2 slides worth of this. I guess that's probably not a good thing when your hypothesis takes up 2 slides, but nevertheless. That pointing and pantomiming, understanding how, what I just explicated, understanding how that works, how you comprehend that kind of communication, is key to understanding where linguistic communication came from. That this was first, this ability to me have communicative intentions and you make inferences and figure out what I mean just with a directing attention. That we have to figure that out, and when we can figure out how humans do that, then we're in a much better position to understand linguistic communication. And indeed, the evolutionary hypothesis is that pointing and pantomiming were uniquely human forms of communication prior to language, somewhere on the way to language. Second, this pointing and pantomiming depend on a species-unique infrastructure of shared intentionality. Here it is again. This is our continuing theme. And this means cooperative social understanding of the type I just said, that we have to both know that this is Mitch's bike before it makes any sense. And that kind of joint attention or common conceptual ground is fundamental to natural gesture communication. So that's the structural cognitive side of it. And the motivational side of it is cooperative social motives, that I'm helping you by informing you of something or sharing some information with you freely, and you know this. And so your inferential process is attuned to figuring out how I think it's relevant or interesting for you. So the motive is cooperatively structured, and the setting or context is cooperatively structured in terms of common ground. And linguistic conventions, now if you think about it, of course, you know, in different languages, in German this is a Flasche, and in English it's a bottle. These are conventions. These are agreements, quote unquote, that we're going to, when we want to direct one another's attention to objects of this sort, we use the word bottle if we're English speakers. So those are conventions. They're agreements, of course. Those are shared. I mean, that's shared is the essence of conventions, that we both know them. If I go to China and I tell them bottle, they're not going to know it. They don't know the convention for it. So linguistic conventions are where the sharedness now extends to the form, to the linguistic vehicle itself is shared. And linguistic conventions are not naturally meaningful, the way I argue these gestures are, but they get their meaning because we have a shared history of learning where we all learned that that's called a bottle if we grew up in an English-speaking community. So now the communication works because we have a sharedness of learning history about how to use that convention. And the second part of the evolutionary hypothesis that I will only go into a little bit today, but just to connect to the previous 2 days, especially the first day, is that the shared intentionality infrastructure that I'm saying creates these the cooperative understanding in terms of joint attention and the social motives. The shared intentionality infrastructure comes from collaborative activities with joint goals and joint attentions. So remember I said on the first day we have these joint goals when we're doing something together. This creates joint attention. So if we're carrying a table together, then I know that your attention is focused on things relevant to our joint goal. So doing something together focuses our attention, helps to focus our attention together and create this common ground where pointing, for example, can make sense. So if while we're carrying the table, I point to an obstacle in the way, you know that I'm not pointing to the color of this thing in the way. I'm pointing to the fact that it's getting ready to trip you up if you don't pay attention to it. And you know that because it's relevant to our joint activity. And again, the motives of helping and sharing, or the motives of informing, come from the helping and sharing motives that are part of joint collaborative activities. If we're doing something together, I stop and help you. And so if you ask the general question, which I've been asked many times, why don't chimps have language? If it's so useful, why don't they have it? They haven't gone through this middle phase where, first of all, they engaged in the right kind of collaborative activities with joint goals and joint attention to set up this shared intentionality infrastructure. They haven't gone through that. And so if they don't have that, then their pointing and pantomiming aren't going to have any purchase. They're not going to have anything to hang on to. So they've missed this middle part. And yes, humans can teach them some things. I'm going to come back at the end to kanji and some of these language learning chimps. I'll come back to that a little bit. Yes, they can learn some things, but I think they're learning them with a different set of cognitive processes because they don't have the shared part. So they're doing something interesting, but it's not exactly the same thing we're doing.